Hey everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we're going to teach you how to play Scythe from Stonemaier Games. Now this is an alternate history 1920s-ish game where mechs were very prevalent back then, and there's farming and some combat, and it's a lot of fun. So let's get right into the instructional video for Scythe. The goal of Scythe is to have amassed the greatest fortune by the end of the game. Players can accumulate coins during the game, but will likely earn most of them during in-game scoring for every star token placed, every territory controlled, and every 2 resources controlled. The higher the player's popularity, the more she will earn in each of those 3 categories. By the end of the game, the player should be looking at a heap of coins. Some additional coins will also be awarded based on where the player builds her structures. Let's discuss some concepts that are important to understand while playing Scythe. A territory is a hex on the board labeled with one of the following terrain types: farm, forest, mountain, tundra, and village are the primary terrain types, but players will also find lake territories as well. The factory is also a type of terrain. Each faction has a home base that serves as a starting point. The player's home base is also where her units will retreat to after losing combat. Because the home base is not a territory, units may not move onto it, structures may not be built on it, and mechs may not be deployed to it. Control is an important concept that much of the gameplay revolves around. A player controls a territory if she has at least 1 unit there, whether it's a character, a worker, or a mech. A player also controls a territory if she has one of her structures there, as long as no enemy unit is also there. Keep in mind, anytime we refer to the word unit, we mean a character, a mech, or a worker. Also, it's important to realize that only 1 player can control a territory at a time. The resource tokens available in the game are metal, found in the mountains, wood, found in the forest, grain, found in the fields, and oil, found in the tundra. Anytime a resource is produced for any reason, it's placed on the board. When a player spends a resource, she removes it from the board and places it back in the general supply. There are no limits to the number of resources tokens in the game. So if the supply does begin to run low, players may use these multiplier tokens included with the game to help indicate the actual number of resources they have. A player may only spend resources from territories she controls, but those resources may be spent for actions related to territories anywhere on the board. For example, she could spend 3 metal tokens she controls on 1 or more territories to deploy a mech on one of the same territories or an entirely different territory. It is important to keep in mind that while workers are produced similarly to resources, they are not considered resources. Only wood, food, metal, and oil are resources. As I mentioned briefly earlier, there are 3 types of units in Scythe: characters, mechs, and workers. These 3 types of units share 2 key similarities. They can move around the board, and they can transport any number of resources that they wish in doing so. Keep in mind that by default, units may not travel over rivers. Units also, by default, may not travel onto lakes. Each of these 3 unit types also have traits that are not shared by the other units, but these concepts will be explained in detail a bit later. For now, just keep in mind that plastic pieces, such as mechs and characters, may take part in combat while wood pieces do not. Players will notice 3 distinct tracks on the board. In the top left corner is the Triumph track. Beneath the Triumph track on the left side of the board is the Popularity track. And on the bottom right corner of the board is the Power track. When setting up the game, the first thing players need to do is place an encounter token on every space that has an encounter icon on it. 11 total tokens will be placed out. Players should place all the resource tokens, coins, and multiplier tokens in a general supply area next to the board. Players shuffle the combat cards and put them on the board in the designated area. Players shuffle the factory cards and then randomly select a number equal to the number of players plus 1. So for a 3-player game, 4 cards. Those cards are then placed face down in a designated location. Players return the remaining factory cards to the box without looking at them. Players shuffle the encounter deck and place it in the designated location, as well as the objective cards. A structure bonus tile is randomly selected and placed at the bottom of the popularity track. Randomly deal 1 faction mat and 1 player mat to each player. It's recommended that if possible, each player should sit near her home base. Both the faction mat and the player mat have information regarding each player's unique number of starting cards and track positions in the box on the far right of the mat. This number indicates where this player will place her power token on the power track. This number indicates the number of combat cards the player will draw during the setup. In this player's case, she won't get any. However, if a player had a different faction, such as the Republic of Polania, she would get 3 cards. The number of combat cards a player has is always public information. However, the contents of those cards is private information known only by the player. This number indicates the number of objective cards the player will draw at the beginning of the game. The contents of these cards is kept secret from the other players. This number indicates where the player will place her popularity token to start the game. In this case, 4. Finally, this number indicates the number of coins the player will start with. Players keep their coins on their faction mats. Keep in mind that while a player's coins are public information, she is never required to count and announce the total to other players. Each player places her character on her faction's home base. Each player then places 1 worker on each of the 2 territories connected to her home base by land. Now let's take a closer look at the player mat. The player mat is where each player will be choosing her actions during the game. The 6 technology cubes are placed on the player mat in the green boxes that have a black square in the bottom right corner. After placing 2 workers on the board already, the players will each have 6 remaining workers, which will be placed on the rectangles above the produce action. The 4 structure tokens go in each of their corresponding boxes. Each player has the exact same 4 structures: the mine, the armory, the mill, and the monument. The 4 cylindrical recruit tokens are placed in their spaces at the bottom of the player mat. The action token starts the game next to the player mat. In addition to the coins, players will also keep their stars on their faction mat, as well as their mechs. And finally, to determine the starting player, take a look at the number in the top right corner of this box on the player mats. Whichever player has the lowest number will go first, and from there, play will proceed clockwise. And that's the setup. There are also Riverwalk reference cards and Quick Start reference cards that may be useful to hand out to the players. Now let's get into the gameplay. Scythe that uses an ongoing action selection mechanism with no rounds or phases. Players take turns one after another until one player places her 6th star, at which point the game ends immediately. On a player's turn, she'll do the following in sequential order. First, she'll place her action token on a different section of her player mat than where it was on her previous turn. Next, she'll optionally take the top row action on that section 1 time. Finally, she'll optionally take the bottom row action of that section 1 time. It's important to remember that while both actions are optional, if the player chooses to take both, she must resolve the top action first before she can resolve the bottom action. Also, while a player does not have to take either action, she must still move her action token on her turn. Anytime a player sees a red box on an action, she should recognize that as a cost. while all green boxes are benefits. When a player takes an action, she must first pay the full cost of that action, and then she may gain as much or as little of the benefit as she wishes. A player may only take an action once on her turn, even if she has the resources necessary to pay the cost multiple times. After the player has completed her turn, the next person in clockwise order takes his turn. Also, if players wish, the next player may begin taking his turn as the previous player is finalizing her decision on the bottom row action. And with higher player counts, it could even be considered crucial to play in this way. Let's take a closer look at each of these top row actions on the player mats. While each top row action may appear in a different order on each player mat, the actions themselves are identical. Know that while I'm explaining the actions to you here, the cost and benefits are based on their unupgraded versions that you see at the beginning of the game. When a player selects the Move Gain action, she may do one of the following two choices. The first choice is to move up to 2 different units she controls from one territory or the home base to one adjacent territory, like this. The second choice is to gain 1 coin. Let's discuss movement in a bit more detail. As I mentioned earlier, units may pick up and drop off any number of resource tokens during a move action. So if this worker was going to move here, he could bring all those resources with him. In addition to resources, the player's mechs can also pick up and drop off any number of her workers during a move action. If they do this, it counts only as 1 movement for her mech and does not count as movement for her workers. So this mech could bring all of this, the worker and these resources, to this hex with 1 move. This also means that, for instance, this mech, if the Riverwalk ability had been unlocked, could move across this river to the tundra, bringing this worker with it, and then this worker could use its movement to move here. Rivers and lakes, by default, will block movement of all units. Certain abilities, however, will break this rule. A river is a body of water that occurs on the border between 2 land territories. A lake is a body of water comprised of an entire territory hex and is indicated by the symbol seen there. It extends from this hex to any adjacent shoreline. This symbol indicates a tunnel is in this territory. For the purposes of the move action for any unit, all territories with the tunnel icon are considered adjacent to each other, meaning that with a single move action, this mech could move to this territory. But what happens when the player moves into an opponent-controlled territory? If the player's character or mech moves into a territory controlled by an opponent's worker only, its movement immediately ends, even if there was an ability that would allow it to move further. Each of the opponent's workers on that territory immediately retreat to that player's home base. If there were any resources on that territory, the workers would be forced to leave those resources behind. The player who moved into the territory then loses 1 popularity for each retreating worker. If the player happened to be at 0 popularity, the workers would still be forced to retreat. A player's worker may never move by themselves into a territory controlled by another player. If the player's character or mech moves into a territory controlled by an opponent's character or mech, its movement ends immediately. Once the player has completed all of her move actions, she checks to see if any of her mechs or characters share a territory with an opponent's character or mech. If they do, then combat occurs. We'll discuss combat in more detail a little bit later in this video. A player's worker may never move by themselves into a territory controlled by the other player's character or mech. Also, if the player used her mech to carry a worker into a territory controlled by another player's character or mech, that worker could not then exit the mech and leave the territory. Any unit, whether it's a mech, a character, or a worker, can move into a territory controlled only by a structure. The player who controls the unit now also controls that territory. If a player's character moves onto a territory with an encounter token, her movement immediately ends. After resolving all other movement and combat for this turn, if her character still is in the territory with the encounter token, then the player discards the encounter token and resolves the encounter. We'll explain encounters in a bit more detail a little later. It's important to keep in mind that there is no limit to the number of same faction units that can be on a territory together. Now let's take a look at the Bolster top row action. To take the Bolster action, the player first pays the 1 coin cost. The player then gains either power or a combat card. If the player chooses power, she increases her power on the power track by 2. Power is the commodity players spend in combat. If the player chooses combat cards, she draws 1 combat card. Combat cards are used to augment the power players spend in combat, and the player may spend up to 1 combat card per character and mech involved in the combat. If a combat card would need to be drawn from an empty deck, first shuffle the discard pile in order to create the new deck. Then draw the card or cards as needed. If somehow there were no combat cards in the deck or discard pile, then no card is drawn. The next top row action we're going to take a look at is the trade action. A player can use the trade action to fill gaps in her available resources or to increase her popularity. First, the player pays the 1 coin cost, and she then gains either resources or popularity. If the player chooses the resources, she gains any 2 resource tokens she wishes. Any combination of oil, metal, food, or wood. In this case, 1 oil and 1 metal. The player then places them on any territory the player controls with at least 1 worker on it. If all of the player's workers were on the home base, since the home base is not a territory, she could not take the trade action for the purpose of paying for resources. If the player instead chooses to gain popularity, she would increase her popularity on the popularity track by 1. Popularity is a commodity used in encounters, but it also determines the player's scoring multiplier at the end of the game. Finally, the last top row action we're going to discuss is the produce action. First, the player must pay any cost indicated right here on the produce action. When the game begins, no cost will be indicated, but as the player recruits workers, cost will begin to be revealed. As is the case with any action, if the player is not able to pay the full cost, whether it's coins, popularity, and or power, she may not choose this action. The player then chooses up to 2 different territories on which to produce. These must be territories the player controls, obviously, and each worker on that territory may produce 1 token. So, if the player were to choose this territory and this territory on which to produce, there is 1 worker in the fields, which produces 1 grain, and 2 workers in the mountains, which will produce 2 metal. As you can see here, any produced resource tokens are placed directly on the territory where they were produced. If a worker produces another worker, as is the case in villages, the player picks up the leftmost worker and places it in that territory. As with units, there is no limit to the number of resources that can be in a territory. There's also, as we've discussed before, no limit to the number of resources in the game, and so, if needed, use the resource multipliers to assist with keeping track of your resources. Now let's discuss the bottom row actions on the player mat. Bottom row actions are always in the exact same order on all player mats. However, the costs and benefits vary a bit. Once a player begins taking her bottom row actions, the next player may begin taking his turn. The bottom row actions are not interactive, but may take a few seconds to figure out, so this will help keep the game moving. Most of the bottom row actions give the player at least 1 coin when she pays to take the action. It's recommended that the player take that coin before continuing resolving the action so that she doesn't forget about it. As with any benefit, if the player doesn't want to take the coin for some reason, she may choose not to. Eventually, a player may complete a bottom row action. In other words, perhaps with Enlist, all 4 enlistment tokens have been enlisted. If that happens, the player may continue to pay the cost of the action in order to gain the coins and any applicable recruit bonus. Each of the bottom row actions has a recruit ongoing bonus found underneath the cylindrical recruit token. If that bonus is exposed, it rewards a player when they take that action. A player is also rewarded when an adjacent opponent takes an action with that same recruit ongoing bonus. Now let's discuss each of the possible bottom actions in detail. The upgrade action improves the efficiency of the infrastructure in the player's growing empires. The resource used for upgrading is oil. To upgrade, the player first pays the cost, then picks up a technology cube from anywhere on the player mat and places it in one of the red squares. To be clear, the technology cube must be picked up from a green square and placed in one of the red bracketed squares. Red boxes with solid red borders, such as this one, are off limits to upgrades. In this example, the player has now increased the benefit of the gain action to 2 coins instead of just 1, while decreasing the cost of the deploy action from 4 metal down to 3 metal. Now let's take a look at the deploy action. The deploy action allows a player to deploy mechs to protect her workers, expand her empire, and add new abilities to her character and other mechs. The resource used to deploy mechs is metal. To deploy a mech, the player pays the cost, chooses any mech on her faction mat, and places that mech in a territory with at least 1 worker. Keep in mind that the player can never deploy a mech on a lake even if that player has an ability that allows mechs to move onto lakes. Once a mech is deployed, the player's character and mechs now gain the ability listed under the chosen mech, in this case, Riverwalk. It's important to note that these abilities are not gained by the player's workers and that these abilities vary from faction to faction. Let's take a moment to discuss each of the abilities that can be unlocked through mech deployment. First, we'll take a look at the Saxony Empire. Every faction has a Riverwalk ability, but each is slightly different in its execution. The Saxony Riverwalk ability allows the player's characters and mechs to cross rivers onto forests and mountains. The Underpass ability allows players to consider mountains adjacent to all tunnels, as long as the player controls that mountain territory. For instance, the player could move from this tunnel territory to this mountain territory since he controls that mountain territory. However, keep in mind, if instead this mech had moved to this tunnel, the player no longer controls that mountain territory and would not be able to move back. The third ability is Disarm. Before a player engages in combat on a territory with a tunnel or her mine, the opponent loses 2 power. It's important to remember that this loss of power takes place on the power track and not in the combat total. Also, this power may be used once per combat, not once per unit. Speed is an ability found with every faction and works exactly the same for each, so I'll only touch on it this one time. Speed allows the player's character or mechs to move 1 additional space per move action. Keep in mind, however, that if any of those units move into a territory containing an enemy's character, mech, or worker, then their movement ends immediately and they cannot move again this turn. Also, workers and resources may be picked up and dropped off in the middle of a move action. The Rusviet Riverwalk ability allows the player to move across rivers onto farms and villages. Next is the Township ability. For the purposes of move actions, Township allows villages the player controls and the factory to be considered adjacent. When the People's Army ability is activated, in combat where the player has at least one worker, the player may play one additional combat card. She will still need a mech or her character in order to participate in combat at all. The Nordic Riverwalk ability allows the player's mechs and character to move across rivers onto forests and mountains. Seaworthy allows the player to move to and from lakes. Also, if the player were to lose a combat, the player could retreat onto an adjacent lake. This is in addition, of course, to being able to still retreat to her home base if she wished. If a mech transports workers onto a lake, those workers may not be left behind when the mech moves off the lake, nor may the workers dismount and move off the lake by themselves. Also, if any resources were transported onto a lake, they may not be left behind either. If two factions have the lake movement ability, it is possible for combat to occur on a lake. Also, structures may not be built on a lake. Before engaging in combat, if the player has the artillery ability, she may pay 1 power to force the opponent to lose 2 power. This loss is reflected directly on the power track as you see here, and may be done once per combat, not once per unit. The Crimea River walk ability, see right there, Crimea River. The Crimea River walk ability allows the player's mechs and characters to cross rivers onto farms and tundra. The Wayfare ability allows the player to move from a territory or home base to any inactive faction's home base on her own, regardless of the distance. So for instance, the player can move from here to here. Just to be clear, an inactive faction is one not currently in the game, including the expansion factions. The Scout ability allows the player, before combat, to steal one of the opponent's combat cards at random and add it to her hand. This may be done once per combat and not once per unit. The Polanian Riverwalk ability allows the player's mechs and character to cross rivers onto villages and mountains. The Submerge ability allows the player to move to and from lakes, and also she may move from one lake to any other lake, similar to tunnel movement. Rules for moving workers and resources onto lakes are exactly the same for the Submerge ability as it was for the Seaworthy ability previously mentioned. The same goes for combat and structures. When the player has the Camaraderie ability activated, she does not lose popularity when forcing an opponent's workers to retreat after she wins combat. Now that we've finished taking a look at all the different mech abilities that can be unlocked, let's get back to the final 2 bottom row actions. The Build action allows players to build structures to enhance their actions, control territories, and get in-game bonuses. The resource to build is wood. To build a structure, the player first pays the cost, then picks any structure from the player mat and places it on a territory she controls that has at least one worker. Only one structure may be built on each territory. So if you're the first player to build a structure on a specific territory, neither you nor any opponent may build another on that territory for the rest of the game. Opponents may not use a player's structure abilities. The player will always receive the structure abilities even if she doesn't control the territory it's on, with the exception of the mill. A player controls a territory if one of her structures is there, even if none of her units are there. However, if an opponent's unit is on the territory, then that territory is now under the opponent's control instead, as you see here. Structures may never be destroyed or moved, and structures may be built on any territory, including the factory territory. The one territory a structure may not be built on is a lake. And keep in mind, since home bases are not territories, structures may not be built on them. When a structure is built, it unlocks a benefit on the player's player mat. This is an additional benefit which is gained when taking the top row action directly above that benefit in the future. Let's discuss the 4 possible structures in a little bit more detail. Once the monument is built, then when the player takes the bolster action, she also gains 1 popularity. The mine acts as a tunnel for the player. However, only the owner of the mine may use it as a tunnel. The player may move units to and from her mine as if it were a tunnel, and that means even if another player currently controls the territory with that player's tunnel, she can move into that territory and attack that player. If the armory is built, then whenever the player takes the trade action, she also gains 1 power. And finally, let's discuss the mill. Whenever the player takes the produce action, the territory with the mill may count as a bonus territory for production. Meaning if the player normally could produce in 2 territories, had a worker here and here, then she could produce in this territory, and then still produce here because the mill allows that territory to produce as a bonus territory. Additionally, if there were 1 or more active workers in the territory with the mill, they would produce as well. So let's say the player uses the produce action and chooses these 2 territories to produce. This territory would gain an additional worker because it's a village. This territory would gain oil because it's a tundra. And then the player can choose to activate this territory as well because the mill is there, gaining 2 more oil. While we're discussing structures, let's go ahead and take a look at the 6 possible structure bonuses players may select at the beginning of the game. This structure bonus allows the player to gain the indicated bonus based on the number of tunnel territories adjacent to her structures. Only count each tunnel once. So in this case, the player would gain a bonus for 3 tunnels. 1, 2, 3. The fact that this tunnel is next to 2 structures has no bearing. A mine will not count as a tunnel for this purpose. Also, rivers do not break adjacency, so if this mill were here, it would still count as adjacent to that tunnel. This structure bonus is based on the number of lakes adjacent to the player's structures. Each lake can only be counted once, so in this case, the player gains the bonus for 1 lake. In this case, the player gains a bonus based on the number of encounter territories adjacent to her structure. Only count each encounter territory once, and these territories count whether or not the encounter token is still on them. Rivers do not break adjacency. This bonus is gained based on the number of structures built on territories with tunnels. In this case, the player would gain the bonus for 2 tunnels. Also, mines do not count as tunnels for these purposes. This bonus is gained based on the number of structures the player has built in a continuous straight line. In this case, 3. Keep in mind that only the longest row of structures would count if there were multiple rows, and rivers do not break the continuity. Finally, this bonus is determined by the number of farms and tundras with the player's structures on them. So in this case, 3. The final bottom row action we need to talk about is the Enlist action. The Enlist action will allow the player to gain a new specialized recruit to join her forces. The resource used to enlist recruits is food. When a recruit is enlisted, it immediately provides a one-time bonus to the player. The recruit token is picked up from the player mat and placed on any of the one-time bonuses on the faction mat. The 4 one-time bonuses are gain 2 power, gain 2 coins, gain 2 popularity, or gain 2 combat cards. In addition to the one-time bonus, each recruit also gives the player a recruit ongoing bonus related to the action from which the recruit was enlisted. In this case, that bonus would be a combat card. This represents a permanent skill the recruit brings to the player's forces. For the rest of the game, anytime the player with the bonus takes the associated bottom row action, she may gain that specified bonus. However, it gets better. That player will also gain the same benefit if a player to her left or right uses that same recruit ongoing bonus. It's important to keep in mind that top row actions have nothing to do with recruit ongoing bonuses and cannot trigger them. Also, While certain factory cards may have similar actions to the bottom row actions, it's important to realize that only that specific bottom row action can trigger a recruit ongoing bonus. Sometimes player order can matter with the recruit ongoing bonus. If more than one player would gain the recruit ongoing bonus, the active player goes first, followed by the player to her left, and then the player to her right. If any of those players place their 6th star as a result, the game ends immediately. It's important that players clearly announce when they are going to take a bottom row action so adjacent players know to check for their recruit ongoing bonuses. Also, as great as it would be in a 2-player game to be considered both to the left and the right of your opponent, in a 2-player game, a recruit ongoing bonus is only gained once when a player's opponent takes the associated action. Each faction has a special ability which you may have noticed in the upper right corner of the faction mat, and is really the only piece of the faction mat we have not discussed yet. Let's take a closer look at each of these. The Crimean coercion ability allows the Crimean player to spend 1 combat card each turn as if it were any one resource token. The number on the combat card is irrelevant, and combat cards are still worth nothing at the end of the game. The Rusviet relentless ability allows that player to use the same section on the player mat as the previous turn. This ability would also apply to any factory cards. Nordic workers are able to use the swim ability. This means that Nordic workers have the ability to cross rivers onto any terrain type other than lakes, of course. This ability applies specifically to workers and not the Nordic character or mechs. The meander ability allows Polania to choose up to 2 options per encounter card instead of the usual 1. The 2 options may be chosen in any order, and the benefit from the first selected option may be used to pay for the second option. It's important to remember that only 1 encounter card is drawn as normal. The Dominate ability allows Saxony to continue gaining stars through completing objectives and winning combat even after the normal cap has been reached. This means the Saxons do not discard their second objective card after completing the first. Also, if Saxony has stars available after winning combat, they must place one. Combat may happen at the end of a player's move action, but before she takes the bottom row action. Combat occurs after all movement has ended if the current player's mechs or character are on a space with another player's mechs or character. Sometimes combat may occur on multiple territories in the same turn. In that case, the attacking player chooses the order in which the combats are resolved. Either the attacker or the defender may gain a star through victory in the combat. Also, other players may try to influence either involved player by bribing them with coins. We'll discuss alliances and bribes in more detail a little bit later. Even if a player has 0 power, she may still initiate combat. If the attacking player has a mech ability that impacts the combat, she uses that ability first, followed by any ability the defending player may have. Also, if combat results in a tie, the attacker wins. Simultaneously and secretly, both players involved in the combat will select a number on their power dial by aligning the number with the symbol at the top. This is the amount of power that player will spend in this combat from her power track. Keep in mind that while the power tracker goes up to 16 power, during combat a player may only spend a maximum of 7. The player may also add 1 combat card per unit involved in the combat. That player will tuck these combat cards behind the wheel of the power dial. The player may use combat cards even if she selects 0 power on the dial. While it's true that the number of combat cards the player has in her hand is public information, during combat the player may conceal whether or not she's used any of those cards. This chart in the top right corner of the board is also found on page 22 of the rulebook, and it outlines how many cards of each power are in the combat card deck. Both players then reveal their power dials and combat cards simultaneously. The player with the highest total power wins the combat. And remember, the attacking player wins ties. Both players then pay the amount of power they selected on their dials, and then discard any combat cards used to the discard pile. It's very important to remember that combat cards do not affect the power track. The winner now has control of the territory and any resource tokens on it. Assuming the winner has an empty combat space on the triumph track, she'll place 1 star on one of the combat spaces on the triumph track. If the winner was also the attacker, she will lose 1 popularity for each worker that was forced to retreat from the territory. So in this case, the blue player would lose 1 popularity. The loser must retreat all of her units to her home base. If any of those units were carrying resources, they would leave them behind, and those resources would now be under control of the winner. If the loser revealed any combat cards or used at least 1 power on the power dial, she does gain 1 combat card into her hand. Each player can gain a maximum of 2 stars for winning combat. However, even once a player is maxed out, she may still engage in combat. If when a player's 6th star is placed, which immediately ends the game, and there are unresolved combats on the board, then the attacking player in the combat must move each of her units involved in combat back to the territory from whence they came. Also, it should be noted, I've always wanted to use the phrase "from whence they came" in a sentence, and so now I have. Lake battles can happen between certain forces due to certain abilities. If a mech transporting workers is attacked while on a lake and the attacker wins the combat, the attacking player loses 1 popularity for each of those workers that mech was transporting. We've mentioned encounters numerous times, so let's take a closer look at them. As the player's character treks across Eastern Europa, she will encounter a number of local people and situations. Each of these encounters will present the player with 3 options which provide different ways for the character to interact with the locals. The choices the player makes will often impact the local population's view of her, raising or lowering her popularity. Anytime a player moves her character onto a territory with one of these encounter tokens, her movement immediately ends and the character may not move again this turn. Once the player's move action is completed and all combats have been resolved, then the player discards the encounter token and draws an encounter card. There are 2 very important things to remember here. First, only characters trigger and resolve encounters. And second, the encounter is triggered after movement and after combat, but before the bottom row actions. Once the player draws the encounter card, she reveals the artwork to all other players and reads out loud the bold all caps text. So in this case, she could enjoy an afternoon festival with the commoners, or enter a battle of wits and lose on purpose, or drink too much and raid the storehouse. The player must choose one option and must pay the cost. However, as usual, she may decide to take as much or as little of the benefit as she likes. If the player does not have enough popularity or coins to pay for certain options, then those options are not available to her. Any resources, structures, mechs, or workers she gains from the encounter card go in the same territory as the encounter took place. Recruit ongoing bonuses are not triggered by any actions a player is instructed to take as a result of an encounter card, nor are any other benefits gained or costs paid beyond what the encounter card states. Once the player has made her selection, she discards the encounter card to the bottom of the encounter card deck. The factory is a place of technological innovation and untapped power. Unlike most other territories, the factory does not produce any resources. However, it is worth 3 territories during in-game scoring for the player who controls it. If a player's character moves onto the factory and is still on the factory at the end of all movement and at the end of any combats, Assuming this is that character's first time on the factory, the player looks through the factory card deck and chooses one card. She then returns the rest of the cards back to their designated location. When a player gains a factory card, she places it next to her player mat. The factory card is now treated just as any other section of her player mat. However, keep in mind that even if the factory card's action is similar to another action on the player mat, they are completely independent of one another and any bonuses do not carry over. Every factory card has a move action as its bottom row action. However, it's a little bit different than the standard move action. It allows the player to move a single unit twice within the same move action. Keep in mind that a player may never have more than one factory card, and once she chooses one, that is the card she'll have for the rest of the game. Let's talk a little bit more about objective cards. As we've discussed, each player starts the game with 2 objective cards. These are kept secret from the other players. A player may reveal a completed objective card either before or after a top row action or before or after a bottom row action. When a player completes an objective, she places a star on the objective space of the triumph track. The player then discards the uncompleted objective to the bottom of the objective card deck. Let's talk a little bit about alliances and bribes. Players are allowed to make informal agreements such as, I won't attack you this turn if you don't attack me next turn. However, it's important to keep in mind that the only tangible items that may be exchanged are coins. Also, a player may not negotiate her way out of a combat that has already begun. So while negotiations beforehand are perfectly allowed, once this player ends her movement on that territory, combat will occur. During combat, it is allowed to attempt to influence the amount of power used through bribery in order to change the outcome of the battle. And other players can also attempt to bribe and negotiate with the players involved. The most important thing to remember here, though, is that agreements made between players are entirely unenforceable and may be broken at any time. When a player reaches a pinnacle of empire building, her faction rewards her with a star. Stars are worth coins at the end of the game and also hasten the end of the game. As indicated by the triumph track, here are the ways to place stars. Complete all 6 upgrades, deploy all 4 mechs, build all 4 structures, enlist all 4 recruits, have all 8 workers on the board, reveal 1 completed objective card, win combat up to 2 times, have 18 popularity, and have 16 power. Again, that may sound like a lot of different options, and there are quite a few for all different playing styles, but to keep an idea and to keep track of what those are, use the triumph track in the top left corner of the board. The game ends the moment a player places her 6th star. This even means that if it happens during the middle of a player's turn, her turn does not finish and the game concludes. If the 6th star comes from taking a bottom row action, the player should gain the primary benefit, coins, and the recruit ongoing bonus before placing the 6th star. If the player has combat that has not yet been resolved, she must undo the movement that caused the combat. If any players would place their 6th star for popularity or power as a result of actions taken by an opponent, the opponent first finishes her turn. Then each player who would place a star does so in turn order. To determine the winner of the game, players accumulate their final fortune, which is made up of any coins they had prior to the game end, plus any in-game coins. There are 3 main scoring categories, and the player will earn differing amounts of coins for each category based on her popularity. So let's discuss each of these scoring categories. The first column is for each star placed during the game. So if a player with 10 popularity placed 4 stars during the game, she would earn 16 coins during in-game scoring. The next column is for the number of territories controlled by the player. This includes lakes and the factory. So if a player with 10 popularity controlled 3 territories, that would be 9 coins. And if that player also controlled the factory, that would be an additional 9 coins because the factory is worth 3 territories during in-game scoring. And the final column is for every 2 resources controlled by the player. So if the player controls 13 resources and has 10 popularity, she'll gain 12 coins. The player will also, of course, gain coins for the structure bonus tile selected at the beginning of the game. The player gains this bonus even if she doesn't control the territory the structures are owned now. The player takes all those coins, adds them to any coins she already possessed, and determines her final score. All players announce their coin totals, and the player with the most coins wins. If multiple players have the same total, they should attempt to break the tie in the following ways. First, the number of workers, mechs, and structures, then power, then popularity, then the number of resource tokens controlled, the number of territories controlled, and finally, the number of star tokens placed on the board. And that's how you play Scythe. I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you will come back and check out more of our videos. You can find me on Twitter @boredoffline. And until next time, if you're bored online, board offline.